All right, well, let's get started today. I would like to say hi and welcome everyone. I am Elizabeth Sutton. I'm the director of the Spurlock Museum. I'd like to again begin today by recognizing and acknowledging that we are on the lands of the Peoria, Kaskaskia, Piankashaw, Wea, Miami, Muscooten, Odawa, Sauk, Meskwaki, Kickapoo, Potawatomi, Ojibwe, and Chickasaw nations. These lands are the traditional territory of these Native nations prior to their forced removal. These lands continue to carry the stories of these nations and their struggles for survival and identity. As the land-grant institution, the University of Illinois has a particular responsibility to acknowledge the peoples of these lands, as well as the histories of dispossession that have allowed for the growth of this institution for the past 150 years. We are also obligated to reflect on and actively address these histories and the role that this university has played in shaping them. This acknowledgement and the centering of Native peoples is a start as we move forward for the next 150 years. Thank you for joining us for this conversation about the political landscape of Illinois. This is part of our ongoing programming series, Contemporary Conversations, and connects to themes in our new museum exhibit, Debates, Decisions, and Demands, Objects of Campaigns and Activism. This exhibit is currently on display in the museum throughout the academic year and investigates the very personal nature of politics, alliances, and the objects of everyday life that represent these relationships. It has perhaps never been clearer in this country that every vote, every alliance can truly make a difference in these elections. And now I'd like to welcome our esteemed panelists and invite them to introduce themselves. Perhaps we'll start with Dr. Tai, since he's also the curator of our exhibit. Dr. Tai?
Well, thank you, Elizabeth. Thank you, everyone, for coming to this wonderful conversation with some of the best historical minds at the University of Illinois. And we're going to have a lovely conversation on Illinois history and Illinois politics, which, as many of you know, is always interesting and fraught and sometimes corrupt. I am Dr. Nathan Tai. I'm an assistant professor of history at the University of Nebraska, Kearney, and an alumni of the history department at the University of Illinois, where I received my PhD in 2019. And as Elizabeth mentioned, also the guest curator of the new exhibit at the Spurlock. So I'd like to begin first, if Dr. Oberdeck wouldn't mind introducing herself.
Sure, no problem. Thank you. I'm Katherine Overdeck. I'm a faculty member in the history department, an associate professor. I teach US history broadly from the mid-19th century through the 20th century, particularly interested in working class cultural history, histories of space and place, and public history more recently.
And then Dr. Wood, would you?
Yes, again, thank you for having me. I'm Dr. Augustus Wood. I also received my PhD from the Department of History at the University of Illinois, and I'm still here as a postdoc in the labor education program. My focus is looking at political economy, social movements, and labor struggles in late 20th and early 21st century African-American urban history. So particularly looking at Atlanta and Black working class struggles in relation to gentrification and labor. So thank you.
And then Professor Toller-Clark.
Thanks. Just echo Gus. Yeah, thank you all for having me. I am Ian Toller-Clark. I am a PhD candidate at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, also in the history department. I'm working on that PhD in the same esteemed cohort as Dr. Tai and Dr. Wood, I might add. I study mass incarceration in US politics since the New Deal. So a lot of what's going on in US politics right now in US political culture is very interesting to me and touches on themes of my dissertation. So I'm really happy to be here and talk about some of that.
And so each of our panelists has kind of prepared a presentation on an aspect of the political history of Illinois. And so we'll begin with Professor Oberdeck, and then Dr. Wood, and then Ian, and we will then have hopefully a fruitful conversation kind of connecting these different histories together. And I welcome all of your comments. Please put them in the chat box, and we'll be able to at the end, we'll be able to kind of work through them. So again, we're going to have a lovely conversation, and I'm excited to hear these stories about Illinois politics and Illinois history.
Okay, thank you, Nathan. I'm going to quickly share my screen. Okay, can everybody see that? All right. All right, so I thought I would talk about the meanings in broad political terms of one of the most, and there were so many very great cataclysmic events in Illinois in the 19th century, but the Haymarket Affair of 1886 was one of the greatest in terms of kinds of political transformations that were going on. So I want to talk about, I'll talk about the event itself, perhaps somewhat minimally, because I want to put it in the context of cultures of working class life that were growing out of the context of rapidly industrializing Chicago in the late 19th century and generating, I think, examples about questions about class, ethnic, and racial tensions that our own society and our own politics are continuing to address today. So I will try to kind of bring some of those themes in. Seen in that way, I think we can understand the conflicts over working class organization that became, in some sense, the object of the judicial outcome of the Haymarket Affair, the trial and ultimate execution of 4 of the anarchists who were arrested because of it. We can see that as growing out of a wider and many-sided working class public and political life in the mid-19th century that I think can get obscured if we just look at the Haymarket event as a sensational riot followed by a sensationalized trial and execution. We don't see, as I think sometimes in the ways that conflicts in our own society that get similarly sensationalized, we don't see the deep arguments and sort of stakes of the people who are involved in those events. So moving right along. So we're looking at what are the meanings of Haymarket in the history of Chicago and the broader history of the United States, and what are some of its political ramifications. And I thought I would just start out with this fairly well-known broadside from the event that was calling working people in Chicago in the May of 1886 to this event. And I think you can note a couple of things about this that that are part of this context that I want to talk about. One, that it's multilingual, and we're talking about a culture that has many recent immigrants who are bringing ideas and influences from a variety of places, and the people who produced this event, who organized it, saw themselves as addressing that diversity. And there's this denunciations of the atrocious act of the police, which is an act the day before that grew out of some of the major labor ideals and battles of the 19th century, particularly a range of strikes that were part of a bigger effort to shorten the working day for working people and get some kind of greater control on their lives. So that focus on police violence, I think, is very important also to the wider context that workers are looking at in the 19th century. So I want to backtrack a little bit and think about the broader national context that's going on in terms of working class organization and kinds of the organizational culture of workers in the immediate post-Civil War period, trying to address what they see happening to their control over their livelihood, and the effects of that more broadly. So there is a post-Civil War growth of labor organizations in response to what is also a post-Civil War expansion of business consolidation. So there are fewer and fewer businesses, they're competing for the same markets. They're in the process trying to economize on the areas that is easiest for them to economize, especially since they're competing in part by buying fairly and increasingly complex technology. So the place that they're cutting down is on wages. And so this is giving rise to a number of grievances, long hours, low wages, workers feeling that they no longer have control over their own part in the labor process, the killing speed on what starts out in Chicago in the packing house industry as the disassembly line, that is taking workers having one little part in taking apart those animals that eventually became dressed beef or pork, and assembly lines as that spreads to other industries, and also declining control over their lives, be it about housing or leisure activities or political life outside the workplace. All of these things are concerns, and they're addressed in a number of different organizations. I'm going to start out with the ones that deal most specifically with work. As we'll see, they expand to broader kinds of issues as we go along. So there had been trades unions for many decades in the United States, but in the post-Civil War period, they kind of reorganized themselves in reaction to many of these issues. And the first ones are trades unions that are based on skills that their organizations are trying to protect from what they see as the degradation to skill that happens as a result of the innovations that eventually give rise to the assembly line. Often in this period, this is sort of pre-big national and international federations. So these are local organizations. They're not necessarily trying to get sort of full control over contract negotiations with their employer or their industry. They're just trying to keep their wages from going down and their hours from going up. However, given the complexity and the chaos that industrial change is producing for workers, new kinds of organizations also evolve. And one of the biggest of those is the Knights of Labor, which instead of being organized by region is organized, by craft, is organized by region. The Knights of Labor organize across different craft lines and also begin to bring in workers who may well have had a skill or a craft before they came into increasingly mass industry that is organized by assembly line, but can't use those anymore. And so instead of just trying to protect the skills of relatively well-off workers, they're trying to organize workers in first a locality, and then they have kind of ascending levels of organization at the region, state, and national level. And in the process, so they're breaking down some also of the social lines that craft unions tend to organize against. Most craft unions are predominantly white and well-off skilled workers. The Knights of Labor, up to a point, not entirely, begin to cross those lines of gender. They have women members. They begin to partly cross lines of race in terms of admitting Black members, although in many cases they are in segregated assemblies, and they have trouble really getting their voices heard at the level above the local assembly, and they speak quite loudly about their frustrations about that. And then the Knights of Labor are completely opposed to the immigration of Chinese workers, who they see as the most dangerous to the declining skills and conditions of workers. And that's very largely based on racial and racist kinds of conceptions, and not so much on the work that the Chinese workers are actually doing. But they are sort of shifting how we think about producing a working class sort of set of ties and solidarities to a certain extent. And following on and rivaling the Knights of Labor, the trade unions begin to get organized as well. They produce what becomes the American Federation of Labor, still around today now with the Congress of Industrial Organizations, and they're emphasizing much more that skilled worker solidarity over political work. And this has become something of a weakness. They are, first of all, more exclusionary than the Knights of Labor, and they are protecting the skills of an increasingly small group of workers because those skills are getting broken down. Okay, so let's put this now in the Chicago context that we want to talk about here in Illinois. So Illinois, and especially Chicago, participated in and amplified all of these trends. Many local trade unions were getting organized in the 1860s. And then Chicago and Illinois in 1867 becomes a very important symbol of a fight that is going to bring together workers throughout this later part of the 19th century, and that's the fight for the 8-hour day. Workers find themselves increasingly working 10-hour, 11-hour days, often with at most a half a day off during the week. And so they're fighting against this, again, decline not only of their experience at work, but this has a huge effect on their ability to participate in home life and or to participate in civic and political life. Part of their argument is, if you don't give us time to read and think and inform ourselves, we cannot be the citizens that we want to be. You're robbing us of that opportunity. So they have these 8-hour movements that start in the 1860s, and in Chicago in particularly, and other cities in Illinois, they pressure the state legislature to pass the nation's first 8-hour law, which is extremely weak, and none of the businesses follow it, but at least it's a law, right? And they're so determined to get it enforced that the day that it is supposed to go into effect, May 1st, 1867, Chicago workers go on strike in a mass way, and they are met with the National Guard and the police, which is another sort of dimension that's happening at the same time. The sort of armies and other sort of military structures that are left over from the Civil War are now being turned against workers. Also, African-American sharecroppers in the South. So when they try to come to Chicago and they find themselves in the same kind of situation, that's also disappointment, especially when white labor organizations will not join hands with them. So that's one of the kind of issues about those failures of cross-racial organization. By the 1870s, this galvanization of the labor movement is declining a little bit because there's a huge depression, as there were many times in the late 19th century. But that does produce another political movement in Chicago. A number of workers' organizations put together a People's Party to get rid of Joseph Medill as mayor. He was the editor of the Chicago Tribune, and they take over the mayoralty, and they also get a number of seats on the city council, and then they turn out to be very disappointing as politicians to other workers because this depression comes and there's no relief. I mean, it's like a pandemic and no relief. So there are groups that I'm going to talk about in a minute that are beginning to think about sort of more broader social change and decide this is just not enough. And so they form a working men's party, as they call it, and they organize marches on the city hall demanding that relief funds that had been gathered only 2 years before for the Chicago fire be used for people who are unemployed. And this also creates a lot of tension, more police and military action against the workers who are doing this. But it gives rise to the kind of institutional formulation of some of these immigrant workers and their own kind of particular version of working class agitation. The Working Men's Party eventually becomes the Socialist Labor Party, very popular with German immigrants, many of whom have come in the wake of the Bismarck's crackdown on socialists in Germany. So they're connected to wider international workers' movements. They are often self-educated, but very, very intensely so. And so they bring kind of new visions of political leadership to the broader movement. And they also create a broader working class cultural sphere where these issues are being addressed. So Turnvereins, the gymnastic kind of clubs that Germans put together, beer gardens, musical performances, reading groups, all these are places where people are encountering each other, maybe outside labor unions, and often talking about the kinds of issues that are going on. So this is what begins to gather together some of our key characters of the Haymarket affair. Albert Parsons, along with his wife, Lucy Parsons, who we're going to hear about, I think, a little later, so I haven't focused as much on her. They are forming the International Working People's Association as they form their own notions of social change. Parsons himself arrives in Chicago from Texas with his wife, Lucy, and he does so at about the same time that the other people who become known as the Haymarket anarchists are arriving often from Europe or from Europe by way of other parts of the United States. And they begin to think of themselves as social revolutionaries or anarchists more opposed to the state, which makes a lot of sense in this context, where when the state is consistently using military and militia force against them every time they just try to march down the street and demand something. Unlike other anarchists, however, these anarchists, the sentence doesn't make it clear on the slide, but they don't believe so much in like the politics of the deed, like an individual act. They still believe in working through trade unions, which many other anarchists have abandoned as too much caught up in the system of capitalism. And they think through that they will build this culture of this alternative culture of a more worker-friendly future. So a lot of their main activities, though they get associated with those scary pictures of bombs, they're editing newspapers, they're making speeches, they're working through their organizations, they're organizing mass strikes, but it's really there that their focus is most important. And they're doing that through then these kind of rival labor organizations in Chicago that have grown out of that national reorganization of labor that happens in the post-war period. So the Knights of Labor are there. They're particularly in English speakers and particularly Irish American workers are in that part of the labor movement. There's the Chicago Trades and Labor Assembly, which is more the trade unionists, somewhat more conservative, somewhat more self-protective group. And then the Central Labor Union that are these more radical unionists, and many of them foreign born. And this organization, this culture is so multicultural and ethnic among these different immigrant groups that they usually have to put, remembering back to that document, they usually have to put out their information in 7 different languages. So let's come back to the Haymarket. What does this mean for the Haymarket? It's partly that this is coming out of the construction of working class culture in Chicago that's diverse. They're having arguments. They're not one big block. But they are trying to get certain things done, which they have been trying to get done for 20 years, like the 8-hour day. So in 1884, the Federation of Organized Trades and Labor Unions, which is kind of a precursor to the AFL, calls for a general strike to happen on May 1st, 1886, as a movement for the 8-hour day. So they say, if we don't get national legislation for an 8-hour day, everybody should go on strike for the 8-hour day. So again, so that we can, the theme was 8 hours for work, 8 hours for sleep, 8 hours for what we will, right? So this, we should have this time to develop ourselves as human beings, not just be tied to the workplace. May 1st, 1886 comes along, no national legislation. And so this strike happens, and its center is Chicago. The biggest marches with Albert Parsons at the front are happening in Chicago, and they are, as usual, immediately met by police and militia reaction. Meanwhile, there is a lot of other strike action going on during this very tumultuous period. So a couple days afterwards, Parsons and some of his friends are making speeches outside the McCormick harvester plant, where the second generation of McCormick's is in charge, and he's just been slashing wages and raising hours, irrespective of what his workers think. They've been locked out for a while. They're trying to keep non-unionized workers from going in. And this group who is having a meeting about the 8-hour day with Parsons moves over and starts kind of interacting with the scuffle around the McCormick plant. The police come, fire into the group, kill 4 of the striking workers. And this puts this culture and network of radical workers, Parsons, and many of the people he works with in parties. He's also an editor of one of the anarchist magazines. This has them talking together, and they decide they should organize this protest meeting the next night at Haymarket Square, which really, it's kind of a dismal night. It's cold, it's rainy. They have several speeches really calling for betterment of the workers. At the very end, when most of the audience has left because they're cold, one speaker says something about, we really have to do something about the police, who are at that moment marching on the rally, despite the fact that the mayor had said to the police, I don't think you need to go. They're just talking after all. But the Captain Bonfield, who is deeply anti rally, does so anyway. A bomb is thrown by nobody yet knows who into the crowd. The police start shooting, and a number of police are killed, and even more of the ralliers are killed. So speeding up, I think, so I don't take too long here, but this clash, in some ways, less of, well, very centrally of weapons and anger, but also of different ways of understanding what Chicago and Illinois should look like. The aftermath is the rounding up of not only the anarchists who are seen to be responsible, but many other labor organizers as well. 8 of them are convicted or are accused of mobilizing this rally and being responsible for the violence and the bomb and put on trial in what is seen nationwide by many people as a completely unjust trial. They have absolutely no evidence of who threw the bomb. And so all of the evidence is based on the beliefs and arguments that these men have made at different points in this wider culture that was very important to who they were. Legal and public appeals lead to 2 changed sentences, and one of the original anarchists was just sentenced not to execution, but to a long prison sentence, and then one of the anarchists condemned to die actually committed suicide before they could execute him. And the wider realm, a Red Scare growing out of this weakens the labor movement. The Knights of Labor, which had been at its peak at this point, declines precipitously, and in many ways the American Federation of Labor benefits from that. And becomes the sort of key organization of the labor movement, who also demands justice for the anarchists. So last kind of political point about this, the person who brings that about is Governor John Peter Altgeld, himself from a working class family. He had kind of made good by various kinds of speculative investments, but never quite forgot his connection to both his immigrant and working class communities. So he reads through all of the material that was produced for the trial and the wider context, about which he says, you know what, the police and the army were shooting on these people all the time. What did you think was going to happen exactly? You know, they were really deeply harassed. So he pardons the 3 surviving Haymarket anarchists and basically loses any kind of hope of a future political career as a result, but believes that that's the thing to do. He's also the Altgeld of the Altgeld Hall at University of Illinois. He believed in public education and that working people should have access not just to education, but really beautiful places to do it in. So he did about 7 of these at different public universities around Illinois. So Haymarket, I will say just by ending, ends up being a deeply important historical memory, both for Chicago, in these memorials, one done in 1893 for the martyrs in Waldheim Cemetery, and the other in the 1980s to memorialize them in the square, and also on international. This is why we have May 1st as International Workers' Day. It was because a worldwide movement understood this as important. But for us, I think today, what speaks to me as being important is how little we kind of hear our political context talking about the bigger arguments of particular kinds of movements that they very quickly brand as one thing or another. And you know, I think that the movements developing now also have that deep intellectual context going on among their members. If we could get that up into the press, that would be great. And then the ongoing issue of that made many of these guys anarchists, but what do we do about the brutality of state power?
Kathy, thank you very, very much for taking us through, you know, an event that I think a lot of folks have some sense of in Illinois, maybe if they're from Chicago, but still, you know, is not as widely known as it should be, unfortunately. Thank you. Next, we have Dr. Wood.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Ty. And everything I'm going to talk about kind of ties directly into what Dr. Oberdeck just went over, because I want to shine a light on what I consider to be one of the greatest figures in Chicago history and actually international history in general, which is Lucy Parsons, Albert Parsons' spouse, and also the one who becomes the superseding leader of a revolutionary ideology in the late 1800s and early 1900s. And kind of what I want to contextualize this with is that, you know, one of the biggest issues we have when discussing leadership in social movements is that they're often pigeonholed as being just this is who that person is. They only believed in this. They didn't really adjust. They didn't take a time to evaluate their strategy and tactics and all that. And that becomes problematic in the way we historicize figures. And so one of the things that I think is so fascinating about Lucy Parsons is that as you dive into her life, what she does is, based on the political economy that she experiences, her ideology shifts. It evolves over time based on this political economy. And so her strategies and tactics shift as well. And that plays a large part because a lot of people think that she was only an anarchist, when in fact, there was some issues related to the ideology of anarchism for her that she decided to switch, particularly with what was happening in the early 1900s following Red Summer and some of these other issues affecting racial oppression in the United States. And so I want to go back a little before she gets to Chicago, because that does kind of play a part. She's born in 1853 in Texas, as Dr. Oberdeck mentioned, and there's not much known about it except that she was in fact the child of slave parents. So she's already in a rural space and she's already experiencing the brunt of racial oppression in 1853. And throughout her life, and this is something she notes in some of the speeches she gave, is that growing up, she became a just kind of a unconscionable or unconditional supporter of liberation. She would often help the slave families, especially helping them escape. She would, and we'll get into this later on, but during the Civil War, she was adamant in terms of helping burn plantations during the Civil War period. You know, her parents and going, you know, so there's a lot of stuff. Even at a young age, she had a very intellectual mind about strategy, and I think that's really key about why she's able to adapt her strategy based on the socio-historical experiences that she found herself into. So what's the big part about this is that but by the time she meets Albert in 1873, she's already involved in helping African Americans during the Reconstruction period. Let's remember that with the Freedmen's Bureau situation in Texas, there were a lot of African Americans at the time who were needing help finding families, registering to vote, getting clothing, jobs, etc. So she was a part of that effort. And then she meets Albert. Now, by this point, she wasn't fully into anarchist ideology. She was a progressive, and she saw the issues of racial oppression, herself being an African-American woman, also mixed with Mexican ancestry as well. So she was key on that, but she didn't have the understanding of the material relations of capital and what's going to come about until she and Albert go to Chicago in 1873. Now, what's really important here is the political economy context, because in 1873, of course, starts the largest depression in US history at the time, the Panic of 1873. And so when you look at what's happening throughout history, whenever there are panics, depressions, or any type of economic downturn, that's when you have a correlation of the largest strike in labor militancy activity. And so when she gets to Chicago, she not only sees a more industrial, in terms of spatiality, the condensing of the neighborhoods, the different geographical areas, but she also sees the organizing. She sees a lot of militancy. She witnesses the strikes, etc., going on at the time. And so a lot of that plays a large part into her developing her ideology. And of course, Albert himself was already into anarchism, but the problem is that she didn't have those experiences yet. So moving to Chicago, it not only heightened her understanding of the racial oppression, but now she develops a class understanding as well, because she's in the working class spaces of Chicago, living with Albert and helping in different ways those labor unions organize. And she starts off very, very small at that point. But let's not forget that, and this is important, the Panic of 1873 goes into 1877 before you start to see any significant economic upturn. So what you had happening, as Dr. Oberdeck mentioned, is that you have these business owners who were taking advantage of a law called the Contract Labor Law of 1864. And what that is that they brought in these large pools of unskilled immigrant labor to these factories and these other spaces and paid them absolutely nothing to do the work. So many of these workers, though, which they didn't count on, because again, that's how the business owners, they don't think about until they actually react to what the workers are doing. They're coming in with their Communist Manifesto in their back pocket, and they're having study sessions and groups, etc. And so you had a bunch of Marxist and anarchist ideologies flowing through the working classes at the time, concurrently with the working with the intelligentsia as well. And so all this is happening in the span of the 1870s. And so then you have the general strike of 1877, the big railroad strike that shuts down a large portion of the country. And in Chicago, you have the newly formed, as Dr. Oberdeck mentioned again, the newly formed Illinois National Guard and Police, of course, were the ones on the scene to shoot and wound the picketers as they went about. Now, what Lucy and Albert are doing at this time is they're providing resources to the strikers and training the workers in negotiating for better contracts. So this is a pivotal moment in labor history as well as Chicago history, because even though many argue that the general strike, railroad strike, was not a successful strike in terms of what they got, what it did was it sparked a very militant and organizing kind of model across the US and in Chicago. Because right after 77, you can say that from 1877 to around probably 1894 and a little bit in 1895, but you have what you call a strike fever period, in that across the country and across different labor sectors, unions were organizing at an expedited rate than they've never done before. And that's what the strike did, because it wasn't just the railroad workers, it was the longshoremen, it was the coal miners, it was other aspects of capital that were working with these organizations to shut down the United States. So that plays a large part in also Lucy's development in understanding what the tactic and strategy should be in being in a space within a large industrial working class, and also being in a space where strikes have been successful. And so she starts developing the idea of the general strike and promoting that. At the same time, she's also organizing women into their unions as well. And so she opens a dress shop and uses that as kind of the meeting space to start organizing female garment workers into the International Ladies Garment Workers Union. So not only has her racial class ideology evolved, but she's also understanding where to put gender into this mix as well. And so it's just really fascinating that when she gets to Chicago, all these things are developing. And now the problem, though, is that once Albert becomes blacklisted for his role in organizing workers, Lucy is now more so starting to move to the forefront, because she is now organizing and training workers. She's publishing works in radical publications like the Socialist newspaper, and she starts her own, what we call rags, called The Alarm in 1883. And this is where she lays out everything in terms of her political ideology in relation to the current mode of capital by the 1880s. And she called it the propaganda by deed position in this article called The Tramp. And she states that only violent direct action like a general strike or the threat of such action is the only pathway to liberation of the working classes. And so she becomes one of the only women organizers at the time to hold such a radical and outspoken position, because she's saying these things in public. Now, later on, you're going to have Ida B. Wells and other women activists speaking out in public, but Lucy Parsons sets the standard for not only positioning a fight against the state, as Dr. Oberdeck mentioned, but also outlining capital as the means to why racial and gender oppression are occurring. And that did not happen until Lucy Parsons did this. And so the other interesting thing about the general strike of 1877, and again, many people consider that to be the first general strike, but the first general strike was actually the slave strike during the Civil War that led to Lincoln having the idea for the Emancipation Proclamation. But what both those strikes demonstrated is that policing became the ruling class understanding of dealing with strikes. You know, there was this idea that you have to repress the workers back into working. There was no National Labor Relations Act. There was no we can legally sit down and sue and this and that. They sent the police and the army after workers. And so by this point, around this time in 1883, when she becomes notarized as being a labor organizer in Chicago, she goes under constant surveillance. She was arrested without cause numerous times. She faced restricted movement throughout the nation by armed police. So if Chicago police heard that she was speaking at a church or some type of center, they would actually lock the doors so nobody could go in and listen, and they would make sure to tape it off so that nobody could come around the area. And they found they were able to do this throughout Illinois. So she really became a target because of her gifted ability at speech and strategic planning and organizing. Now, going into the Haymarket situation, when she attempted to witness her husband Albert's execution after he was scapegoated after the massacre, she was arrested and she was held in a cell with her children until after the execution with no clothes on. And so it becomes at that point to where she really ups the ante in organizing and sees the 1890s as being a crucial point for her, particularly 1894. In 1894, she organizes the first ever mass march on Washington, D.C. in history with an organizer named Jacob Coxley. Now, she argued that the army of the unemployed, and this is where you start seeing some of her Marxism starting to develop, because again, she's very fluid on her ideological scale. She was an anarchist, but she did dabble in Marxism to a certain degree, and she argued that the army of the unemployed must be an actual army to demand federal relief for the economic crises, that the unemployed can be used as a militant force along with the underemployed working classes to develop power against the state. And so she's doing this. She's also organizing a boycott on State Street stores during the Chicago Teamsters strike. She's helping the Spruce Valley Coal Company to unionize, and she still finds some time to leaflet door to door in Chicago neighborhoods, giving speeches when she was able to get into the buildings or just having them outside. And she became the leading figure in the development between 1895 and 1905 of this thing called the Continental Congress of Labor in Chicago. And by 1905, this Continental Congress finally came together, and she was one of the first women to join this newly created Industrial Workers of the World organization. Now, what's interesting about this group and why Lucy was so big on them is that if you read her speeches and writings, one of her biggest arguments and the flaws of organizations like the AFL is that they were tied directly to capital. And the arguments that the AFL did not fully support the railroad general strikes of 1877. In fact, there are arguments that the AFL actually allowed the police to gain footholds in parts of the strike that helped weaken it. And so this is something that a lot of different organizations had feelings about. But Lucy said, no, we're going to have an organization that not only breaks the racial and gender lines to organize across spaces, but we're also going to be a lot more militant and not beholden to what is going to be called later on business unionism. The idea that you do just enough to protect capital, but you give breadcrumbs to the workers. She develops it, and she gives an amazing speech at the convention in 1905. So she becomes this key strategy and tactics person for the IWW. And then she brings up this new point called the sit-down strike and says, no longer will workers starve when we just go home and we picket on lines and stuff outside the factory. No. Now we're going to actually sit down in the factory space so they can't scab or replace us, so that all these things are happening, and now the bosses will starve. That was her whole thing. So she was always just revolutionizing the ways that strikes can be more effective as the state became more violent and repressive, because that's one of the things that she knew the state couldn't do, at least the ones that the employers and the owners of the factories didn't do that were smart, was that you can't blow up the machinery. You can't shoot it out and destroy your own machinery. So she was thinking of ways to gain more leverage over time as she goes on. That this is just absolutely truly amazing that a lot of the ways that we think of strikes and militant labor action were because of the way Lucy saw the Chicago working classes and how she proposed these new ideas. So she further expands her ideology in this thing called the Liberator, which became the official IWW periodical that as she started getting more so involved in women's rights. The women's rights to get fair wages, women's rights to not have to be married. So she got to some cultural elements as well. So again, she's evolving. Now here's where things get really interesting with Lucy, because even though she was the cultural aspect of women's rights were significant to her, she still saw class or class struggle as being the primary issue under oppression. By 1925, there is a new top anarchist named Emma Goldman who says, I don't know if class is that big of a deal as much as it used to be. And the working classes being this group that can lead us to liberation, I don't know. We need to move more towards the cultural aspects of women's rights. And that's when Lucy and her created probably one of the biggest rivalries on the left in US history, because Lucy tried to push the anarchist movement back to the working classes and back to this idea of labor struggles, racial class, etc. Emma said, we're going to do it via women, gender, culture. And so that broke apart, and Lucy became disillusioned with the anarchist movement. And she wrote some really interesting things about the anarchist movement not being ready for any real revolution. And she started working with the newly formed Communist Party of the USA at that time. Now, again, she doesn't join until 1939, but she is an active 24-hour-a-day member in terms of the service she gave to the Communist Party. Now, this is where the racial elements get big, because one of the biggest knocks from scholars on the Communist Party USA was that they did not engage in any legitimate racial work. And while that is true in many spaces, it wasn't true in Chicago, because Lucy was not going to allow the CPUSA in Chicago to not organize Black workers. And so she was elected to the national executive of the International Labor Defense to fight for the civil rights of workers, and she moved it to dealing with racial oppression. She was adamant in that if we create this labor defense body, we need to find victims of racial oppression and we need to support and defend them. And so she gets involved in the liberation of the Scottsboro Boys. She helps defend Angelo Herndon, who was a 20-year-old Black communist from Georgia who was facing 20 years in prison for inciting an insurrection. And we all know what that means. And so she moved the CPUSA and forced them into Black communities. That's important to understand, is that she was a guiding force into organizing African Americans. And that's why you have some of the really hardcore Black communists come about. You have the creation of the African Blood Brotherhood that comes out of this, which became the #1 Black communist organization in the US. And a lot of it was because of Lucy Parsons and other activists as well. She wasn't the only one, but she was the most vocal one about pushing for the CPUSA to be in Black organization, to be in Black institutions and neighborhoods. Very important. And so she argued that the oppression of Blacks in the US was rooted in capitalist exploitation, and she pushed that as a political education objective. And so she's doing all of this work, and everything is really flowing for the next few years. During the Great Depression, she's working with the Black neighborhoods there, and at that time as well. And to kind of end this now, because I do want to get time for questions, etc., she passes away in 1942 in a house fire. This is how bad they saw her, and this is what the Chicago police called. They call her more dangerous than 1,000 rioters. And it's because like that right after they declared her passed away, the Chicago police did this full-on raid of her house and took all of her books, all of her writings, everything that she owned, and locked it away. And to this day, we still don't know where those things are. And so either they destroyed them or they're still locked away to this day in the Chicago Police Department. But that's what a threat that the state recognized Lucy Parsons as being is because not only was she an amazing orator, a tactician to the best degree, but it's the way she evaluated the political economy. She evaluated the strategy of social movement organization, and she shifted over time to match what the current socio-historical experience was for the working classes. And it was a lot of it because of what happened in her relationship to Chicago, living in a place where not only it was urban, it was more, as Dr. Oberdeck mentioned, it was diverse, and there was so much room for organizing. And I didn't get into the stuff with Pullman that she helped with and other stuff as well. So there's just so much involved in it. But I just want to make sure we understand that her biggest contribution is her ability to evaluate and to tie it to the political economy and how to organize effectively with leverage. So I'll stop there.
Gus, thank you so much for kind of expanding on one of the most important figures kind of within, Chicago working class history, Chicago political history, and, the woman who keeps alive the memory of the Haymarket for generations, right? Such an important figure in the history of Illinois. And now we'll have Ian kind of share his deep knowledge of the political history of the Midwest and Illinois.
Thank you, Nate, for that introduction. Yeah, so I'm going to take us in a little bit of a different direction for a couple minutes and fast forward to the middle of the 20th century and talk about two kind of, we could describe them maybe as political luminaries in some sense, in that they might be two of the most famous, or at least I think of them as two of the most famous Illinoisans to come out of the mid 20th century, and that would be Adelaide Stevenson and Everett Dirksen. So I'll start with Adelaide Stevenson because he's his claim to fame and his time in the national spotlight is earlier, and then we'll get to Dirksen. So Adelaide Stevenson is most famous for losing twice to Dwight D. Eisenhower, 1952 and 1956. So he's in the same category as Henry Clay, another Midwester, Williams Jennings Bryan, in having run multiple times for president and lost. It's a small group of people. But before he ran for office in 52 and 56, he had served as the governor of Illinois. And then after his two runs, right, he was still kind of considered, a high-ranking official in the Democratic Party. So when JFK actually wins in 1960, he appoints Adelaide Stevenson to the U.S. ambassadorship to the United Nations. And there's this very famous picture of him at the UN during the Cuban Missile Crisis, pointing out silos where, they were building nuclear weapons. So some of you might be familiar with that photo. But again, I think that these two runs that he had in 56 and 52 are really important. We always like to think of the loser as someone we can forget about, but as Gus and Kathy so eloquently discussed with us, right? Like they sometimes have the most important impact on political culture and political economy. And so Adelaide is definitely part of that. His two runs during that time, he's influential in that he is kind of the first prominent Democrat to kind of, I would say, make suburban professionals, right? So you have this rising middle class that happens after World War II, and he's kind of the first candidate in some ways to actually get them to kind of coalesce them together. It's obviously not enough to win in 52, 56. Eisenhower actually does pretty well in the suburbs, but Adelaide Stevenson shows a path for a kind of, as Lily Geisimer describes it, a rational and moral brand of progressive politics that found widespread appeal among suburban professionals. So while he's ultimately unsuccessful in doing this in 52 and 56, throughout the 60s, suburban professionals do start to kind of move towards the Democratic Party in some of these suburbs, and these suburbs, much like today, become these hotly contested regions. So again, that history, it's not new. This is something that has been going back since, the end of the World War II, that Democrats can be, competitive within suburban America. And this is actually, right, it's part of this actually labor history, right, where you have the Democratic Party starting to abandon those union halls and the unions in favor of the white collar professional. And Adelaide Stevenson's 2 runs are really consequential to that because he kind of provides a path forward. He also, his earliest supporters wind up, moving into the Democratic Party, guys like Paul Butler, who's actually from Indiana, so another Midwestern politician. He creates a space within the Democratic Party for liberals in a way, so they could actually compete with and take some power away from those Southern Dixiecrats that still kind of had control over the Republican or over the Democratic Party. He, moving this Paul Butler gentleman into the DNC, he becomes the head of the DNC in 1954. Creates a place for liberals to actually have some space in the national spotlight. So that's really that's why I wanted us, that's why I brought up Adelaide Stevenson, to really think about the role of the Democratic Party in the suburbs. But also, I mean, and again, like he's unsuccessful in the suburbs of California, Wisconsin, Michigan, Massachusetts. These suburban professionals do start to become heavily interested in Democratic Party politics, involved in Democratic Party politics. And that's how you see, right, the shift of Massachusetts, the shift of California, which until the immediate post-war era, right, was actually a Republican stronghold. Same with Wisconsin too, right? It's the suburbs of Wisconsin, ironically enough, that make Wisconsin a swing region or a swing state, not on the national level, but locally. And so there's that. The last thing I'll mention about Adelaide Stevenson is that in Losing, he also showed the ways of how not to do political advertising. So I know none of us are tired of political ads and we want more of them. So if you do go to like sites like Living Room Candidate, you can see his ads and compare them to Eisenhower's. And what you'll notice is his are 2-minute long. He's sitting at his desk in a room that's supposed to look like, the kind of West Wing Oval Office, right? And he gives these long 2-minute kind of infomercials about what he would do when it comes to certain kind of issues and where he stands on the issues, right? He is, if anyone knows anything about him or has heard anything about him, he is your stereotypical egghead candidate. That's where we actually get kind of that stereotype from, is Adelaide, because he was described as an egghead. Whereas Eisenhower's spots were these, they were Madison Avenue designed and created, very pithy. They hired actors off the street to come in and record these little snippets of like, we want low taxes. And then you just have it, and then you have a cutaway to Eisenhower being like, I approve this message. So 52 is really great for that, and 56 for getting these like 2 different versions of what political advertising would look like. The Adelaide Stevenson infomercial that's 2-minute long, or the 30-second spot that Eisenhower had. And of course, Eisenhower goes on to crush Adelaide. So that's Adelaide Stevenson. And then the other gentleman we'll talk about for a second here is Everett Dirksen, who most of us probably know him for, at one point it was mentioned earlier, right, for his gravelly voice, kind of being an old-fashioned politician in some ways, right? There's this story, I think Nate maybe introduced this to me a very long time ago, of Nicholas Kazenbach, who's like Assistant Attorney General of the United States. Him and Everett Dirksen were the 2 guys that were negotiating the Civil Rights Bill when it made it over to the Senate. And there's this very famous adage of Nicholas Kazenbach going, yeah, so when we were negotiating that deal, we had to make sure we got it done before he had too much bourbon. And he would then forget what he'd negotiated the night before, right? He's very famous for, chain smoker, 3 packs a day, drinking a lot. And that we'll go back to that in a second, right? But yeah, he was the minority leader of the US Senate in 1964. So he's instrumental in helping pass the Civil Rights Bill out of the US Senate because he was able to get enough Republican votes to, vote pass cloture, right? And in those days, it wasn't 50, it wasn't 60 votes. You needed 63 or something, 67, I think. It was a 2/3. You need 67, I think, in order to get past cloture. So in that, he had a huge impact over the Civil Rights Act. So when the Civil Rights Act made it out of the House of Representatives, it has a very aggressive, what they called equal Employment Opportunity Commission that was going to be able to enforce the Civil Rights Act's kind of regulations against employment discrimination. They had the ability, this commission was going to have the ability to sue directly employers for employment discrimination and all these things. Everett Dirksen, he was, we want to think of him as kind of a liberal Republican, but he was a conservative Republican. He did not like the New Deal. He was, considered the US Senator of the Chamber of Commerce. And so in that role, he very much, the one thing he did was make sure that he could kind of detooth the EEOC. And so what he did was, when he was in that meeting, he basically said, in order for me to have my votes, what we need to do is make this commission go from something that has the power to enforce the law to something that can investigate acts, instances of employer discrimination. And then, they'll make a recommendation to Justice Department, and then they can go about handling it. And so that's what happened, right? That was the thing in Johnson and Hubert Humphrey from Minnesota, these politicians, at the end of the day, what they wanted to see was public accommodations and other types of desegregation made, or other types of segregation made illegal. So they were willing to bargain away the power of the EEOC in order to ensure that those other things occurred. And so that's what happened. So that was, I think, important to remember the ways in which this minority leader, there was only like 33 or so Republican members of the US Senate at the time, but he was able to exert that power and take that employment discrimination enforcement out of the EEOC's hands. But that's not, I don't think, his biggest kind of contribution in national politics. I think what it is, right, he had a lot to say about the legal doctrine of what we can call one person, one vote. And he did a lot of work in the last couple of years of his life to try to, overturn the Supreme Court's decision in Reynolds v. Sims. So Baker v. Carr, Reynolds v. Sims, these two decisions, real briefly, basically what they do is ensure that states would have to apportion their legislative districts and congressional districts by population. So before these two laws, especially Reynolds v. Sims in 1964, state legislatures could, and they did in some instances, apportion one of their houses based off of population and one off of like land or something like that. And the idea here is to maintain power for rural elites. Right. And this is at a time after World War II when cities are growing and also metropolitan areas are going. So what you're seeing is that suburbanites and, those within the city themselves don't have the same amount of power as those that were living in the rural parts of America. Right. This rural versus urban split. Right. But we should think about it as metros versus rural, because the suburbs are also places that don't have equal representation at this time. But Dirksen, being from Pekin, Illinois, deeply felt that power should retain in these rural kind of constituencies and areas. So he very much disagreed with Reynolds v. Sims, and he launched this and became the national spokesman in many ways for this movement against these decisions. First, he tried to pass a rider onto a foreign aid bill in the middle of the 1964 presidential election in order to delay, sort of like with education desegregation, the Supreme Court said with all deliberate speed. He tried to kind of work in a similar thing where the states could, with all deliberate speed, have to reapportion their state legislatures. And I should say at this time that, with the exception of like Oregon and one other state, Wyoming, state legislatures are so badly malapportioned at this time that literally after these two Supreme Court decisions came through, every state but Wyoming and Oregon was going to have to reapportion their legislative districts on the state level in both houses, right? So he tried to get this rider worked in. It was ultimately unsuccessful. And one of the reasons he did this was both, again, for this kind of principle reason, you could say, but really it's about power. But this other reason is he's trying to consolidate the Republican Party, who's going through a tough election in 1964. Moderates are upset with Goldwater over his vote against the Civil Rights Act. He's trying to keep these guys together. And this, he thinks, is the legislative congressional strategy that's going to make that happen. And so after the election, what he tries to do is he pursues a kind of two-pronged strategy. He actually pursues a constitutional amendment, tries to get it passed through the Senate, and then also tries to get 2/3 of the states to call for a national convention or a constitutional convention to get the states just to pass a constitutional amendment that would allow the states to apportion one of their districts by population and one any other way. So a lot of states would have done land to kind of give rural places more power. Ultimately, it's also unsuccessful, in part because states like Wisconsin and Tennessee would not go for it, because the Republicans in those states are seeing that they're actually winning suburban voters. Suburban white voters are starting to coalesce around the Republican Party. And so Republicans are like, we don't actually need to do this because we can be competitive with these voters. So again, just to wrap up, right? This is to kind of get us to understand why the suburbs have become this, like, we focus on them so much in our US political culture today. Why we also think of them as predominantly white spaces too, right? But yeah, so this is how some of that actually occurred and how both parties kind of found their way to the suburbs as this space of organizing, and then, you know, kind of erased this great labor history that influenced both parties. Okay, so I'll end on that note. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ian. I know you have a wealth of knowledge about, you know, post-45 Midwestern politics that I'm hoping we have some really good questions, you know, that we can dig into these kinds of things. And thank you again to all our presenters for sharing their deep knowledge kind of about the complicated and complex histories of, you know, labor politics and politics in the state of Illinois and the city of Chicago. So kind of my first, you know, question that I'd, you know, and I ask, you know, our attendees, if you have questions, please put your questions in the Q&A forum, and we'll hopefully be able to, you know, work through those. And I just have, you know, just a couple of questions to get us thinking and maybe spark some discussion. And the first one is, you know, what is, and all of you kind of touch on this, you know, what is it about Chicago and what's it about Illinois that allows these figures and these movements to really get launched? You know, that Chicago and Illinois have so many, and you've all touched on them, you know, Haymarket, Pullman, the IWW, you know, and that the launch of these political careers. I think, you know, something that Ian didn't point to, but like Adelaide Stevenson's grandfather is the vice president during Pullman. You know, he's coming from a deep political, well, not a deep political dynasty, but that a family that again is shaping politics, having this international presence. And then kind of the other question, you know, and we can, you know, also get at this one is, as Kathy kind of talked about, the memory and the commemoration of these figures, and pointing to the Haymarket Memorial in Chicago, which is where Lucy Parsons is also buried. But Adelaide Stevenson also has, you know, a series of one of his homes is owned by the Chicago Park District, right? And then he's buried with his grandfather in Bloomington. So if any of you, you know, in the central Champaign area, you want to see the tombstone of Grover Cleveland's vice president and the former United Nations Attorney General, it's just up the road in Bloomington. Very exciting drive. Very interesting cemetery. So I guess, yeah, this kind of like question of Chicago, Illinois exceptionalism in politics, and then, you know, a discussion about memory, and then hopefully, you know, more from our attendees. So I don't know who wants to kind of grapple with these things first.
I'm not sure that it's so much Chicago exceptionalism as Chicago kind of condenses and intensifies what is going on elsewhere, in part because at this particular moment, it is the industrial transportation center of so many different industries and processes, and so many people depend upon it. Therefore, if you stop it, it affects a lot of people. You get a lot of attention, and you know, at the same time, that is part of the reason it's attracting all of these folks who you know, who are both pretty sure they can find some way to make a living there, although there are a lot of people having trouble doing that, but also, you know, have ideas about what they can do. That Chicago really is, I think, a place to go to to think about what's wrong with society and what it can be during, at least during this late 19th century period. But I think it's as a result of being at the center of things that, you know, it's also shaping things that are going on elsewhere around the country in really important ways.
Just I think Dr. Oberdeck said it best. I can only just add on to that, in that when you look at its geographical and social spatiality, I think that plays a large part into the way Chicago was developed over time. And one of the best examples, and this is something I thought I was going to talk about instead of Lucy Parsons, but I just, whenever I get a chance to talk about Lucy Parsons, I have to do it. But the Pullman neighborhoods. Again, when you look at the company town model, and I know Dr. Oberdeck has written some really great stuff on this that I'm going to borrow a little bit of it now, is that when you look at the way the company town models are organized, though, and what George Pullman was doing in African-American neighborhoods, you really have a lot of clashing of the issues of race, class, and gender at those moments. And so when we actually start digging deep and kind of get into what N was talking about, when you look at how the political organization of the space is in relation to the geographic and social space, then you're going to have nothing but intense contestation and struggle. And we've seen this in other spaces, but it's just like with Chicago, especially with the Great Migration, it being one of the dominant cities, there's just an accelerated case of it happening in Chicago during these time periods. So, yeah.
Ian, do you have thoughts on Illinois exceptionalism? You're muted, by the way.
I was just gonna, I think Gus and Kathy did a great job of summing it all up for us. I was just gonna add, I agree that I don't know if it's so much exceptionalism as just, it's a great cauldron for these things to happen in, and it just provides a model. Like, I think just thinking historiographically and in terms of memory, historians gravitate towards Chicago. So we just have the stories located in Chicago. But these are local trends that are happening all over the place, right? Like the suburb stuff, that phenomenon, people write about it in Wisconsin, in Massachusetts, Charlottesville, Atlanta. But yeah, so that, we can see that this is something going on across the world, and Chicago is just a great cauldron that has attracted a lot of historians.
We have time for questions from any of the attendees. If anybody wants to pop a question in the question and answer, otherwise we'll press ahead and kind of get at this question of memory and commemoration. Well, then that's, I guess, that kind of follow-up question is what is it about the commemoration of these events? Haymarket is still commemorated every year, right? And it's still, such an important site for kind of working class politics and working class memory. And there's other sites like that in Illinois, right? We can talk about Mount Olive, we can talk about Mother Jones, kind of outside St. Louis, but there's also, also commemoration of these other politicians, right? And there's other historic sites, because of the number of presidents that have come from Illinois and other kind of politicians, right? You can go to the Reagan birth site, you can go to the Ulysses S. Grant store in Galena, right? You can stop at any number of Lincoln spots, around the state. And this is one of the things, for those who are able to see the exhibit, this is something we're trying to kind of parse out. And so in the exhibit itself, right, we have materials from the Adelaide Stevenson campaign. We have in 1952 and 1956, we have Knights of Labor material from the 1880s and other politicians connected with the state, William Jennings Bryan, Joe Cannon, who's the Speaker of the House at the turn of the century, Barack Obama, and then also, material reflecting more recent events. There are photographs of, Black Lives Matter protests and Tea Party protests within the state of Illinois. We also have material from even stuff on campus. There's artifacts from the most recent GEO strike, which I know Gus was very, very involved in as our union co-president. And so there's, you know, a lot of the material parts of politics. And so I'm kind of interested, again, this question of memory, this question of commemoration, and kind of the physicality of, you know, these movements and how they kind of speak to, again, this is more of a comment than a question. And I know how much we hate that in this discipline. So I'll just leave it up to all of you to parse out that.
There's kind of an ironic other side of the commemoration of the Haymarket, because in Haymarket Square, what first got put up there was actually a statue commemorating the policeman who had died, and it got battered a lot by various sorts of folks, and then finally knocked down in the 1960s. And so they decided to move it and put it up in I think a police training institute in Chicago, so that it would, which says something about what we might think about monuments. And in some ways, the monument I showed very briefly of the cart, the speaker's cart from, so that's what Albert Parsons and Augustus and their Confederates spoke from. And the idea, I think, about that was like going to be a first piece. They haven't really done this, but they were going to sort of try to kind of create this larger context around it. So I think it's, you know, and I think it's partly because it was interesting. I was kind of looking through popular things that are said about the Haymarket, just out of curiosity, and there's a tendency to say, well, so the Haymarket affair happened in the 1880s, and there was some concerns afterwards, and then it was rediscovered in the 1980s. You know, there were these, I mean, the fact that May Day becomes this sort of international workers holiday that isn't actually recognized in the United States quite as much, but that, you know, I think that's also a testament to who do we look to for what is a commemoration, and you know, from what perspective on history does it come that Haymarket was forgotten for a century when in fact it was remembered quite vividly.
Yeah, 100% agree. And that's one of the things I argue, and kind of the stuff that we do, is that there's an ideological bent to commemoration, and that it's very telling that every other country in the world can draw crowds of millions on May Day. When you look at the pictures and videos online on May 1st, and that in the U.S., the U.S. presidents always change it to Law Day or Legal Day, or whatever it was this past year. I don't even remember what it was, but it's always something surrounding this idea of law and order. And so again, when we look at these spaces and how memory operates, you know, when there is an attention to what we call political education, which is the learning of your social conditions, and not only to understand them, but also to develop either solution-driven intelligence or some type of questioning, as what we do with any type of events that we do. There has to be some acknowledgement that there's a reasoning why these things are happening. And I think we get too caught up in just saying, well, that's just how the US is. They don't celebrate May Day, or, well, you know, they don't talk about this statue. They don't talk about the Haymarket commemoration. I think it's upon us. We have to take the responsibility to shine the light on these memories. And it's our job to say, no, this is important because this is why we have to learn from this and what we can develop from this. And I you know, again, that's just something that, particularly in our field in academia, that we have to continue to push on, and so that the public can understand why these memories matter today and how we can develop solutions for a better tomorrow. And so that's why memory is ideological in a lot of ways, is because we have to take it for the purposes of progressive work. So.
Yeah, definitely. And just to build off that real quickly as we wrap up, just because Nate, you talked about that material aspect of campaigning, right? I'll go back to those Stevenson and Eisenhower ads, right? But just like, if you use just those ads to understand that election, right, it'll flatten out any of the organizing that, like, even, you know, as much as we might not like the two major parties in this country, like, it just flattens away all that organizing that was going on in the Democratic Party to kind of cultivate a base with suburbanites and maybe think about their social position, their economic position, so on and so forth. So that is one way that, like, I think you can see the ideology of memory actually play out in some ways, right? Is that if you just like look at if you just look at the material itself and do that type of reading without going into other sources and doing other things, you'll get a different picture. Because again, if you look at those ads, you're like, clearly Eisenhower is going to win this because these are fun Madison Avenue ads. There's the great, you know, Eisenhower jingle and these absolutely boring Stevenson ads. And so, like, when you think about politics as performance, you see why, you know, Eisenhower is just shellacks Stevenson. But then if you actually, we go back and we look at what's going on in the ground, it's a different story. And that's probably, you know, there's a ideological reason why we learn the history the way we learn it, right?
No, thank you all. This has been a vibrant and fascinating discussion. I hope, you know, I know I've learned a lot about the dynamics of Illinois politics and its complicated history. I hope everyone has enjoyed our conversation this evening. I want to thank again our panelists, Dr. Oberdeck, Dr. Wood, and Professor Clark. Thank you all so much for spending some time with us this afternoon and this evening to share your expertise in the political history of the state of Illinois. Again, thank you all so much. Thank you for everyone for attending, and thank you to the Spurlock Museum again for putting this on. And if you have the time and you're in the Champaign area and you know, the Spurlock Museum is now open, you can see the new exhibit safely, socially distanced, and I hope you all enjoy it. Again, thank you all. Have a good evening. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Spurlock.
Thank you. Yeah.